To part two of our walk through Fanon's Wretched of the Earth. So I think where we wound up last time was on page 7, we're going to move a little bit quicker than we did in the first video. We kind of ended where Frantz Fanon was writing about monotheism in religion, the division between radically good and radically evil, that depicts the colonizer as the good and the colonized as the evil. And that this symbolic order structures the imaginary and the psychic life as well as exploitation that goes on within colonial society. The dehumanization of the colonized subject in terms, by literally referencing the decolonized subject. The colonized subject is something like, an animal, something he writes about on page 7. Page 8, he introduces a character that gets discussed throughout the book, the colonized intellectual. So this is generally in the book a kind of object of derision, at least an object of a problematic person. So this is a colonized subject who has gone off and been educated in the colony, in the colonial power, like Algerians who have gone to France, or people from Martinique who have gone to France, and educated in French language universities and become thoroughly acculturated within the European language and culture of the colonizer. And so this person is generally compromised. So even though they are viewed to a degree as a kind of exemplar of the colonized peoples, they're an imperfect mirror, right? So there are people who often take a leadership position within the colonized society, but they are highly problematic. And so even though there's a little bit of ambivalence, once he gets into a discussion of national consciousness, he winds up seeing that colonized intellectuals can play a positive role, but in general he's ambivalent about them. Another character that's introduced fairly early on and that gets talked about a lot is the colonial bourgeoisie. So these are not state operatives, not colonizers as such, but capitalists who don't directly control colonists, but nevertheless are there as a kind of elite within colonial society. Very, very strong ties back to the colonizer. And that they often attempt to co-opt the intellectuals, so the colonized intellectual can become owned by, in essence, or submissive to the bourgeoisie. And then the colonized subject then is often defined again in the colonist terms. The demand for decolonization, the last shall be first, is a theme again that he brings up all the time. So he's creating these different characters that play out in different ways in the drama of decolonization. And we're going to find out that he tends to put most of his weight on the revolutionary subject that he thinks is best emergent in rural areas, so that the rural masses, the peasants even, he believes, the people who are most likely to become decisive forces in the struggle for liberation. And that this is, we're going to find out, is different from Marx and Gramsci and others, right? All right, so page 11, he writes about the colonized intellectual, right? The member, the basically the black man at this point who had gone to European universities. The colonized intellectual witnesses the destruction of all of his idols, egoism, arrogant recrimination, and the idiotic, childish need to have the last word. Pulverized by the colonialist culture, discover the strength of the village assembly. So he claims that really the way to redeem the intellectual is to get them away from the colonizers' cultural centers, away from even the colonial capital, and to get them out into the local villages and so on, where they're going to live with the people, see the kind of deprivation firsthand, and become an actual voice of the people instead of a kind of voice of the colonizer. So again, they're intermediaries. The intellectuals are intermediary between the colonized and the colonizer. to the degree to which they're simply becoming, looking down on the colonized subject from the standpoint of the colonizer, they're a negative force. The degree to which they're reflecting up the colonized subject's worldview and so on, and becoming a mirror for them, they play a positive role. So that's what Fanon is looking here for the colonized intellectual to become a revolutionary leader, a leader of thought for a liberatory movement. Worried about the colonized intellectual and the colonized, the colonial bourgeoisie becoming endocolonists. He writes about the vulgar opportunism that can sometimes plague colonized intellectuals. So much of what he's doing here is he's identifying sort of traps or pitfalls en route between being a European colony and being a free society. That in the process of decolonialization, there's these different characters that emerge, and if the alignment of those characters is the alignment of the characters is going to be decisive in determining whether the colony becomes free or not, right? And then the way it can go wrong. So they cannot. This is a big idea. The colonized intellectual cannot represent the nation. They're too attached to the colonizer. Okay, let's leave this out. That their view of history is going to be the history of the colonizer, not the history from the standpoint of the colonized. So again, it needs to be a voice up, a mirror of the colonized in order to be a politically potent force, instead of being a kind of ideological, propagandistic force of the colonizer. Two types of revolutionaries: those in the town and those in the in the rural areas, the peasantry. He worries about the town people. They often desire gains. They're often focused on private gain, their private interests, and often kind of view themselves as a class apart from rural areas. And he believes, again, that given the undeveloped nature of colonies, where a large percentage of the population is still rural peasants, producers, that is the rural areas that have genuine revolutionary power. He has the section or the chapter on spontaneous insurrection as being something that the rural masses can really contribute to. Okay. He writes about the power of political assemblage, the idea of creating revolutionary heroes, having hero narratives about people who sacrifice for the cause, that all of this helps develop something like a revolutionary consciousness. So again, what he's doing here is theorizing the persons and the kind of a culture necessary in the process of developing a revolutionary movement. He writes about page 31 of this concept of atmospheric violence as opposed to revolutionary violence. And he just says, look, that the colonized is constantly faced in a colony with atmospheric violence. The colonizers are always using annihilatory violence to keep the colonized in place, and that revolutionary violence against the colonizers is just necessary, right? And so he's worried again, and he writes about all of the people who condemn revolutionary violence as a morally flawed thing when the atmospheric violence of the colony gets a pass. All right, so how does a national consciousness get developed? There's going to be more on this later. Let's leave that. He worries about people compromising and condemning violence, that the intellectuals often do that, whereas he's trying to justify violence, revolutionary violence is necessary. I won't read it, but page 34 is where he talks about the revolutionary situation is ripe for a wave of decolonization to take place. He's writing in the midst of this, and that you really are in the middle of a political structure that's falling apart, and a revolutionary situation has emerged. So then he's talking about the impact of the Cold War, page 36 on. USSR and China, sometimes aid the decolonization movements, although they're ambivalent, as he says, that because they often try to create satellite states, and that the newly freed people, the newly decolonized state, is often then made to be a kind of servant of the USSR or China, which is a problem. He's always trying to keep people independent here. He's looking for resources, but not patronage. and he writes about the U.S. as being the baron of capitalism, where they're often playing a counter-revolutionary war. They really fear the spread of communism, the spread of socialism among the masses. And so there, as we know, this is very true of American interventions in the mid-20th century in the Cold War, that decolonization was often steered by American operatives in a pro-capitalist direction. So he says, neutrality in the Cold War is probably the preferred stance of the decolonized, but that the capital investment that would come from one of the Cold War superpowers would bring strings with it that would limit the ability of the culture to develop its own its own national consciousness, national structure, and so on, that meets the needs of the individual nation. All right, so page 42 goes back to the discussion of violence in decolonization. Again, it's legitimate, it's needed. He calls it an absolute praxis on page 44. Again, this is something that many Marxists write about, the idea of praxis, the kind of theoretically informed action that leads the society towards revolution or towards a progressive change. And again, he's admitting flat out that this is going to be a violent process. So again, atmospheric violence in colonies is high anyway, and at least decolonizing violence gets results. And as he says in chapter 5, it's actually liberatory or redemptive. Collective consciousness, national consciousness, he claims, is something that's not going to be created off of the pen of intellectuals, but is something that's going to be forged in the process of revolution itself. Page 16. God, have I jumped around? Yeah, I did. I actually did this in reverse order. We'll just go back to page 16 if you're not quite there yet. The colonized subject, envy, and the desire to replace. That this is a subjectivity that is not a happy subjectivity, right? You're not well fed and comfortable, but you're on edge, and envy is going to be part of the subjectivity. Ready to rebel through spontaneous action. Page 17 is rewrites. Remember we talked about the muscular tension that was exhibited in many of the patients who had been tortured, had been in camps. That there are these subject tense, ready to spring, ready to defend, right, defensive posture, and that this is something that's common among colonized subject, that muscular tension. Page 17 and 18, he writes about the ideological fog that makes it difficult to see the colonist as the cause of trouble or the cause of discord. And that means that there's a misrecognition of the enemy, such that that members of the colonized group will fight each other in fratricide, right? He calls it collective suicide, that they're actually going to kill each other, they're going to misrecognize each other, and not bond together in solidarity against the colonizer. All right, then he begins to talk about some of the difficulties of indigenous culture that are present. So these are things that help keep an ideological fog in place that prevent people from moving from colonized subjects into revolutionary subjects. So one of those things is the indigenous culture of magic. He talks about zombies in Caribbean culture. They keep the colonized subjects in place. That it becomes a kind of a way where you're not quite seeing reality. Reality testing isn't quite accurate because you're thinking in magical terms. And so page 19, that this magical culture is going to be lost in revolution. So even as being sustained in the colony, it's going to be lost when you decolonize anyhow, because revolutionary activity is going to dispel myths and rumors, and reality is going to press itself upon people with quite a bit of force. Page 18 and 19, dance and ritual and kind of indigenous culture. He writes about it in a kind of a negative way. It's a containment structure, that the more people engage in these sort of indigenous festivals and carnivalesque activities, the more they're dispelling energy that could better be used for revolutionary change in kind of these repetitious activities. So rather than engaging in the cathartic expenditure of energy in ritual, better to expend it in violence. So machine guns and warfare, he says, will make better catharsis, will be more healing again. So again, the praxis of violence is written about on page 21. So rather than dancing and engaging in ritual activity or festival activity, violence, revolutionary violence. All right, so then he writes about what happens when the political opportunity, page 21, the revolutionary moment arises. The political parties, he says, that exist are often a problem because they get in the way. So they keep the colonized subject in the position of a colonized subject and prevent the movement into a revolutionary subject because they tend to be accommodationist, pacifying, reformist. And so they're trying to get people to accommodate the colonial structure, get some concessions rather than reject. Page 23, you can read about that. Colonialist bourgeoisie is too nonviolent, too compromised, or their interests are clearly to global capital and to the colonial power, and they always see compromise as well. So these are forces, counter-revolutionary forces, or at least contra-revolutionary forces. Guerrilla warfare becomes an important tactic. It's a way for people who are outmatched militarily to nevertheless use violence in a way that promotes revolution. And then he claims that one of the reasons why a revolutionary situation has arisen in the colonies is the alteration in capital, so that the colonies are not merely places of resource extraction, but instead are actually places of their export markets, where the local population is engaged in labor is also people engaged in consumption. So because they're export markets, capital now has an incentive in sort of developing the export market. And that means that capital will sometimes engage in assistance towards a revolution activity, as long as it's under the control of bourgeois elites, people who are and then page 28, a religion is a pacifying force. So that brings us up then, we'll skip ahead again to page 51. Make sure I've got this right. Yeah. So even at the individual level, Fanon writes, the colonized subject is going to find redemption or something like therapy in violence, right? So if you're living in a fundamentally violent culture, you can restore yourself through something like vengeance, and vengeance that's rational, not directed into kind of a blood feud against a direct small other, against a person who's like you, but instead against the system as a mechanism to bring about, again, a progressive change. He even talks about that colonized subject can be enlightened by violence against the oppressor, that by seeing the impact of guerrilla activity or the impact of revolutionary activity, of insurrection, that this will actually be a kind of a motivator. You're going to get a feedback loop going. So again, he's basically writing here something like a recipe book for decolonization. So page 52 to 55, back to the Cold War again. Decolonized nations should remain neutral. Don't join either side. This is the superpowers fight. Let them do it. But of the two, he's much more suspicious of U.S. capitalism. And on page 56, that socialism is probably the only way that an indigenous population is going to be able to move forward in a way that isn't oppressive or isn't exploitative. And so some kind of socialist structure, he is a Marxist here, is going to be important, and but again, not really becoming a satellite of the Soviets. So it's not that kind of state socialism, but more of an a locally generated version. Okay, so there's going to be a need to repatriate wealth and capital. By colonizers, is going to be a discussion of that. He doesn't really talk much about that, but his idea is that if the colonizer or the other European powers, the United Nations, give relief or aid to the decolonized peoples, that this is in some way, he calls it reparations for it. And then he says that in the intelligence agents who learned that there is an insurrection coming, capitalism, global capitalism often pull capital out. So there isn't going to be this repatriation of capital back to the colonizer is going to happen quickly. So at any rate, he mentions on page 58 what we now would call world systems theory. It's not what the term he used, of course. Very, very good writing. Europe is literally the creation of the third world. The riches which are choking it are those plundered from the underdeveloped peoples. He goes on to quite a bit of good language about this. So there it is. If you do get aid from these from other countries, from the United Nations and so on, this is reparation. And such aid must be considered the final stage of a dual consciousness, the consciousness of the colonized, that it is their due, and the consciousness of the capitalist powers, that effectively they must pay up. So it's this recognition that whatever has happened in the colonial powers, capitalism is in extracting resources and labor without adequate compensation from the colonized peoples, and that some kind of reparations may be in order. All right, but again, that's not really where he's putting his weight. All right, I'm going to skip through this. Page 62, his discussion. So the last paragraph of this chapter, he writes about this colossal task, which consists of reintroducing man, again, sorry for the sexist language, but reintroducing man into the world, man in his totality, creating a universal subject that has the particularity of the nation, will be achieved with the crucial help of the European masses, who would do well to confess that they have often rallied behind the position of our common masters on colonial issues. So this is a call towards the European populace who is opposed to colonial exploitation, to put political pressure on elites to assist in the post-colonial struggles. In order to do this, the European masses must first of all decide to wake up, put on their thinking caps, and stop playing the irresponsible game of Sleeping Beauty. Okay, so kind of interesting argument there. So chapter 2, I'll try to do it really fast. Chapter 2 is on grandeur and weakness of spontaneity. This is this argument that the rural masses, the peasants, are in a good position to foster revolution, but it's in a kind of a spontaneous way, insurrection. And he writes that there's that often, as Marx and Gramsci found, that there's a kind of a difficulty in keeping the rural masses linked into a revolutionary mode. That there's often rural workers will often accommodate or obtain concessions from the colonizer, and that this can wind up turning rural insurrections aside. And so the transition, page 86, from spontaneous rebellion or insurrection to revolution is difficult to sustain. The peasants will often get disarmed by concessions from the colonizers, and therefore it requires leadership, cooperation between the urban and rural masses, and national consciousness. I haven't mentioned the word yet, lumpen proletariat, but he writes about the rural workers in the midst of the changes surrounding decolonization will often flow into the cities, swelling the ranks of the lumpen proletariat. But this is a kind of a built-in sort of shock troops for insurrection, and that they can be organized and brought into existence, or brought into effective use through, again, leadership and so on. So he thinks that the development of national consciousness is going to be essential, and that's the subject of the next chapter that begins on page 97. So national consciousness is something, this is basic argument, it's going to emerge in the process of revolutionary activity itself. That again, it's not coming off of the pen of an intellectual, it's something that's been theorized by Marx. Instead, it's something that is going to percolate up as the situation unfolds, and that the people who are involved in the struggle against the colonists are going to be forging, a kind of ideas, a concept of what's going on that's developing and emerging from the action that's taken place. So he's concerned about something like a bad revolution. In this chapter, he's talking about the ways things can go wrong again. The wrong people get in power, adventurers, exploiters, and so on. The colonial bourgeoisie, that kind of thing, colonial. you can wind up with things going really bad really quickly, exploitative structures put in place, ethnic cleansing can emerge, ultranationalism, tribal warfare, and so on, kind of balkanization, as he says. Racism can really emerge that gets in the way of different tribal groups or different subsectors of the colonized peoples working together. He worries about economic predation, religious divisions that often get mapped onto tribal divisions, again, that can really wreak havoc with the kind of solidarity needed to bring about a revolution. Tribe, race, that all of these things weaken revolutionary solidarity, making it more possible for the colonial power to either resist and to therefore sustain the colony or to work against decolonization. Page 111, he writes about the fear of the one-party state, of a dictatorship, a totalitarian structure, of an absolutism. He fears of neocolonialism, where something like the bourgeoisie gets in power and sort of remaps with new names, new faces, but remaps the colonized society again. You just basically change the colonizer, leaving the colonized in place. So therefore, again, it's kind of a general emancipation. A change in consciousness is important, not just a change of ruler, right? All right. So again, he fears that, again, the continuation of high structural inequality, that this gets in the way of revolutionary activity, and then it's going to be a problem to try to be avoided after the revolution ends. Page 124 to 5. Again, populism and authoritarianism has really, really good discussions of that. 124 through 129. Page 130, the solution then is he wants to get people out of the capital. So there's this idea that since the colonial capital was the tie between the European colonial power and the local society, the native society, you want to get people out of that capital, out into the sort of the authentic heartland of the nation. I hate that language, but there it is. Again, as there's a race to the capital, the ranks of the lumpen proletariat can swell. So after the revolution, you don't want this. Maybe before the revolution, it can be useful because that can help develop, again, a kind of insurrection force. But afterwards, get people, unemployed people especially, even leaders out of the capital into the backcountry or the rural areas. Again, that these colonies are undeveloped, relatively undeveloped. Large percentage of the population is rural. So if you're going to develop, that's where to develop, right? So don't develop the connection to the European powers. That'll just turn you into, again, a new colony. Instead, develop the local culture. All right. So revolutionary actions develop its own national consciousness. Education is going to occur as the political structure matures. So you're seeking political maturity. So the development of a post-colonial subject, now not just a revolutionary subject, but a post-colonial subject, page 138 on through 140, I really like this. The post-colonial subject isn't like somebody who's interested in sports or fun or entertainment. And he keeps writing about you don't want to have a romantic reaction where you're going back to kind of reinventing or reinvigorating traditional carnival spectacles, religious beliefs, magic practices, authentic, a culture. Instead, he argues that that a functional post-colonial subject is one that's focused on primarily work and politics, right? So your cultural activity is primarily going to be aimed at village and local tribunals, where, again, you're going to be doing distributed politics, participatory democracy of a kind, and where work is, and doing work and being hard-working, being to a degree self-sacrificing for the movement, right, for the new post-colonial society will be what you want. So the subject after the revolution is someone who's going to want to participate in politics, want to comprehend and understand, be a self-managing person in a local community, and then be focused upon work, not extraction, and so on. All right. And then the notion on page 142 that the nation is inclusive. It has to include all of the subgroups within it, including women and so on. Although, again, I don't find a lot of emphasis on women, but there it is. Page 144, new symbols can emerge, and that becomes the center then of national consciousness. So page 146 on the chapter on national culture. So this is it. So this is where, these colonized intellectuals can play a role. Let's jump right to page 158 and 159. He describes 3 stages of the development of the colonized intellectual writer. So in phase 1, there's an assimilation to the colonizer's culture, right? So you're basically the local representative going off and getting trained in the big city in Europe and then coming back and bringing that culture back. So you're basically a mediator that is a conduit for the ideas, for that, for the colonizer's worldview, that colonizer's symbolic order to be affirmed, ignited, made real for the local population. So it's really a contra-revolutionary force, right? A conservative force. However, you want to change that. Well, then if you don't want to be a colonizer or just that, then there's this problem of the search for the romantic reignition or rediscovery of the authentic pre-colonial indigenous culture. So he has a long section writing about this, about adopting the kind of artistic styles that predated colonization, or music, or religious ideas, or folk narratives, and so on. That this is a kind of resurrection of something like a culture that existed prior to colonization. As he writes about it, though, most of that was already wiped out. And even if it wasn't wiped out, it can't actually move people into a post-colonial world. So an attempt to recreate the culture of the pre-colonial past generally has a conservative force. So it doesn't tend to move people in a direction of progressive change. It tends to lock them in to a rearward-looking consumption of pre-colonial culture. So it's a romantic reaction, right? And something to be avoided. And so what's much more, so that's a negative intellectual, but then the positive is where it's what he calls the combat stage. So you're engaged in agitation and sort of becoming a symbolic leader of the resistance, of the insurrection. You're becoming an active agent in defining the revolutionary situation, the revolutionary process, generating new cultural heroes, telling the tale of what's about to happen, writing about the wrongs that are ongoing to help mobilize people, to get people committed to the cause, and so on. So rewriting new myths, doing new kinds of art, new staging, new stories, etc. That celebrate the revolution, the resistance, and so this is how a new national culture is created. It's not a resurrection or a kind of archaeological uncovering of the past. It's something that's emergent. So it's not that you wouldn't have any indigenous culture or any of those sort of symbols or styles of the pre-colonial past, but rather that's not enough. And that what really matters is attending to the situation as it unfolds and having a functional, instrumental culture with a lot of reality testing that's very inclusive, that's very participatory, that brings the nation along, matures the nation in political potency so that you can have a post-colonial culture fit for heroes to live in, right? So page 169 to 70, again, celebrating and promoting revolutionary violence. This is something he doesn't want. He thinks you can't shrink from. You can't shrink from the violence, that it's there, it's atmospheric, and so you must be willing to accept it and explain it even if need be. And then page 178, after the revolution, both the colonized and the colonizer are gone, and therefore there's this moment where you're no longer either affiliated with the colonizer or the colonized. You're now in a kind of moment where new particularity, new social structure can emerge, new vocations, new positions. And so you're not going to resurrect the old. We're not going to go back to, we don't want there to be new colonizer. We want there to be a true social revolution that restructures society, right? A new culture. So it's not nationalism in a totalitarian sense. It's a national culture that he's looking at. So the natural culture would be something that could provide coherence to the kind of cooperative, progressive, forward-looking. He calls it historical, right? You're entering history here. So it's a historical movement. So again, looking towards the past isn't going to do it. So with that, I think we're going to end our discussion of Fanon. So again, it's 60 years ago now that these post-colonial societies came into being, that the great wave of decolonization occurred. But his ideas are still relevant. There's still liberatory movements everywhere that are still dealing and coping with the problematic that Fanon writes about. And then Fanon's writings are essential to critical race theory, that the way that he describes the structure of that the racial structuration of society, the way in which that structure generates a symbolic order that fundamentally shapes consciousness, is decisive. The way that the colonizer, the power, always has a greater ability to impose a symbolic order that benefits them, from which an imaginary is generated of stories and images and so on that benefit the colonizers. And so the colonized always have to have, again, that kind of double consciousness, and the development of as he says, a revolutionary consciousness, and then a post-colonial consciousness that would, facilitate and sensibly integrate people into a post-colonial world. With that, we'll stop. I hope this was useful.